With its $12 billion strong economy and a population size of only 1.7 million citizens, Equatorial Guinea is one of the wealthiest countries in Africa in terms of GDP per capita, which is basically what everybody makes or should make if a country's wealth were evenly distributed. By this metric, Equatorial Guineans sit right under South Africa and surpass the likes of Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, and Morocco in terms of wealth. But that's all on paper, as unprecedented levels of corruption and human rights abuses have made this otherwise rich nation one of Africa's most successful failures. And I'll tell you how that happened. So let's start with who is in charge of this nation. Teodoro Obiang Mbasogo. This guy has been president of Equatorial Guinea for over 40 years, and he is currently the longest serving president on earth. Equatorial Guinea is more like a family business to him than it is a country. Teodoro took over power in 1979 after a successful coup d'etat against his own uncle, and he has remained in office ever since. He has since survived more than a dozen coup attempts. This guy has the plot armor Kwame Nkrumah never had, and to say he rules with an iron fist would be an understatement. His uncle was no saint either. During his brutal reign as president for life, as he had declared himself, the life expectancy in Equatorial Guinea dropped to 30 years. No one was safe. He targeted intellectuals, political opponents, and even his own family. If he considered you a threat, he'd make you vanish. He reportedly killed 1/3 of his country's population during his reign, and is widely considered as one of the most ruthless dictators ever. There's also evidence to suggest that he suffered some form of mental illness. Not that mattered during his prosecution, as he was tried by his nephew's government and executed by firing squad. And even then, local soldiers were scared of carrying out the sentence on account of his alleged magical powers. And so the tax was designated to Moroccan troops. Talk about hardcore. This guy was menacing to the very end. But back to his somewhat less authoritarian nephew, President Teodoro. He has an estimated net worth of around 600 million United States dollars, according to Forbes, which shouldn't come as a surprise, considering the country ranks amongst the bottom 10 most corrupt countries on the planet. So how does he keep his seat? Well, through free and fair elections. If you believe that. His lowest performing year at the polls was in 2016, when he pulled in a measly 93.7% of total votes cast. 93.7%. And that's on a bad election year. In 2002, one voting district was recorded as giving President Teodoro 103% of total votes. This guy has dead people voting for him. As you can probably guess, opposition is practically non-existent, because speaking out against him can land you in prison or worse. Oh, and did I mention his vice president happens to be his own son? You should probably know that by now. He's famous on Instagram. He carries himself about like a Hollywood playboy. Kind of reminds me of Hush Puppy, always flexing and showing off his vast wealth, which he amassed through hard work and humble beginnings. Vice President Nguema, or as I like to call him, Little Teodoro, lives in a constant stream of fun and enjoyment, despite the fact that 2/3 of his country live in poverty, and the life expectancy is 60 years, which is lower than the continent's average of 64 years. But that's still better than his great uncle's regime, when only luck determined if you'd make it past age 30. This guy has more lawsuits than Donald Trump and Hunter Biden put together. My favorite Instagram reel of him to this day is probably in 2023 at the UN Summit, when he gave a meticulous tour of his $75,000 per night 5-star penthouse in New York to his followers before proceeding to beg the white man for aid for his country. The United States and other European countries have seized and auctioned many of his assets on grounds of embezzlement to the tune of several tens of millions of euros. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. His younger brother, Gabriel Obiang Lima, is also a minister in his father's government, I beg your pardon, serving as Minister of Finance, Economy and Planning. He previously served as Minister for Mines and Hydrocarbons. Because this country is mineral rich. And you know what the good book says, where a man's treasure is, there will be his heart also. Or in this case, there will be his children also. So there goes the country's wealth, into private accounts, luxury cars, fancy mansions, side chicks, or side wives. Imagine having one of Africa's highest GDP per capita and still having most of your population live in poverty. That's Equatorial Guinea for you. The country's economy is heavily dependent on oil. Oil production accounts for about 78 to 85% of the country's current GDP. And so when there is a fluctuation in global oil prices, it reflects in the economy, for better or worse. The oil won't last forever though, so everyone is cashing out, and there's little progress made in diversifying the economy. Should that time come, the petroleum sector currently represents more than 90% of the country's current exports. All oil-dependent nations across the world are racing against time to diversify their economy, while others care more about stashing their plunder than diversification. That's the source of this legend's caring goals. He was following that trend, got caught in the web of corruption, and his private business got leaked by officials who were carrying out investigations. That's the nature of such authoritarian regimes. There's always someone waiting to stab another in the back, so they can replace them, just to continue in the same cycle of corruption. About 80% of the oil revenue also goes into infrastructure, with projects usually inflated and awarded to companies with close ties with the ruling class. A measly 5% is spent on the education and health budget of the country, which comes at little concern to the ruling class, since they only patronize private services, mostly overseas. Even Ghana spends more on education and health than Equatorial Guinea, and our GDP per capita is 3 times less. There's food insecurity in the country, as 60% of the population struggle to meet their daily needs on less than $1 per day. And even though much of the country's population are into agriculture, they still import more than 70% of what they eat. This wouldn't be lackable if the country wasn't vastly arable and perfectly conducive for agriculture. More than 26.2% of children under 5 are malnourished, and 52% of pregnant women are anemic. On top of that, 1/3 of the population don't have access to electricity or running water. The list goes on. It makes it all too obvious that all this is just a front to cover up the rot within the wound. The logic behind the infrastructure miracle as seen in the capital and in the heart of some literal slants is twisted. A country must first be affordable to its own people before courting foreigners. That's the wisdom behind cities like Oslo, California, Tokyo, and Singapore. But when 2/3 of your population struggle to keep body and soul together, let alone ever dream of living the high life like the small ruling class does, then you have no business projecting all of this to the world. Misplaced priorities is all it is. There's a stark contrast between Malibu's elite and rural communities that seems stark in another century. If you live in a more developed island, where the capital has been hidden away from the lower masses, then you are living the dream. But if you find yourself in some parts of the mainland, then that's a different story. The many cases of corruption and human rights abuses has prompted the international community to distance itself from Equatorial Guinea, and this has also affected tourism. I mean, look at all this beauty. This country looks like God had so much free time and decided to get creative. Many things about this country screams tourism, and yet their biggest publicity they've had in recent years was on account of this man-horse exploits. And that tells a lot about the country's international perception. A country like Equatorial Guinea, given her many economic advantages, should have been a shining example for other African countries to follow. But that's sadly not the case. The people are in shackles. And where is the military in all of this? They've been tamed, comfortably corrupt as well. But honestly, I loathe the idea of a military takeover of any government, given the fact that our men in uniform are no saints, and so should not be trusted with absolute rule. So I'm on the fence on that alternative, not that it will ever happen anyway. Now compare Equatorial Guinea or most African countries to Norway, for instance, also an oil-rich country, but in their case, the oil revenues are transferred to the government pension fund, which then invests this money into publicly traded companies. The fund now owns roughly 1.5% of all publicly traded companies around the world, roughly 900 companies worldwide, and is estimated to continue to fund Norway's social cost for another 300 years. At the end of the day, prosperity is not rocket science, it's common sense, and that's greatly lacking in a lot of African leaders today. So the case of Equatorial Guinea is a typical African case of poverty. All these years after independence, and we still can't explain why the continent is so impoverished without pointing fingers at the white man. We do everything just to avoid facing our own obvious reality. Africa's problem has always been one of leadership, specifically the greed of leadership. Ethnic politics, family and friends governments, you know how it goes. So whether it's Equatorial Guinea, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya or Ghana, it's all the same. Anyway, this is nearly everything wrong with Equatorial Guinea. What did I leave out?